This video was intended as an objective analysis of events and individuals. It does not serve as an endorsement of any actions, ideologies, or beliefs expressed by the subjects depicted. All third-party clips and materials are used for commentary, criticism, and educational purposes, and remain the property of their respective owners. This video includes discussion of serious allegations and sensitive subject matter. These claims are presented for analysis and have not been independently verified within this video. Viewer discretion is advised.
Anyone who does not drive a Ferrari is a lazy idiot. It is that easy to get rich in the world today.
I told a girl this one time, I'll never forget it. We were going to break up. I said, you're going to have a harder time replacing me than I have replacing you.
It's okay that nobody cares about young men.
He went and kicked it with some of the guys in the manosphere.
There's a difference between a man and a woman. If I cheat on my girl, I'm going to go back to my wife.
Leave it to Gen Z to rebrand laziness and social awkwardness as something cutesy, like a stay-at-home son. They did.
You have to sacrifice your lower self to your higher self.
Trying to looks max, life max.
A for alpha, B for beta. I saw on a stream recently, your dad sent you a text message. It said full-blown addict. How'd you feel when he sent you that message?
Well, that's a sad one because it's like you don't want to upset your parents.
Do you see anything wrong with this picture? Yes, someone's missing. And that person is my father.
Online fathers. Truthfully, if you spend any amount of time on the internet, or at least vaguely aware of current cultural events, we're seeing a multitude of disturbing trends socially, culturally, psychologically, economically, and otherwise. We're seeing regressions back towards animalistic, racialistic viewpoints and understandings of the world, and anti-Semitism has risen significantly since the October 7th, 2023 attacks. We're seeing the functional failure, dishonesty of, and subsequent loss of trust in some of our most fundamental institutions as a society as they expose themselves and actively lie to the public. We're seeing upticks in politically motivated violence and political radicalization relative to the previous couple of decades. We're seeing technological advancements and AI change the economic and cultural landscape. As we're about to see, every revolutionary invention demands change. Economic structures and institutions change. Downsprung from those changes often follow changes in social order and the way that we interact with the world. In the first season of this series, we'll be covering what I believe to be some of the structural stressors that young men are suffering from, and the psychological responses and some of the physical consequences that are occurring as a result. I believe that it's important to start the series off with the soul of young men as the subject, because as a young man myself, I'm intimately aware of some of the issues I'll be discussing in this video, and the multiple that'll follow. And objectively, young men have historically been the most capable of making physical change in the world, as they have been the most motivated and most physically capable demographic of society since the dawn of time, as indicated throughout repeated trends within war-torn periods of human history, where if a tyrant wanted to eliminate the chance of rebellion, young males would be targeted first, even as young as infants. Even today in the US, all healthy males are required to register for selective service when they reach adulthood. Alternatively, within war-torn contexts, young women have not historically occupied the same role. So young men have historically been the enforcement arm of the state, and also by extension, have been recognized by the state as the primary force behind violent rebellions. Throughout the history of academia, there's often been juxtaposition between two philosophical propositions when diagnosing issues at the individual and society-wide levels. One, the proposition that the ultimate battle is fought within the individual, and to save the world, one must first fix themselves, then their household, then their community, then their city, and so on. Versus number two, the proposition that all issues are downsprung from governing systems, federal, economical, societal, and environmental systems. And to see individual personal change, these systems and environments must be changed and or toppled to provide people the chance to change by removing the stressors or alleviating the problems entirely. From my analysis, both are correct within certain contexts, but as we're about to see, a healthy family is one of the most fundamental building blocks of a functioning society, but also simultaneously, as eloquently put by Dr. Thomas Sowell in his book, Race and Culture, humans often react and structure their cultures and institutions in response to the environmental factors and opportunities, which maps perfectly onto the proposition that individual problems can be downstream from systems and environments in an objective sense. The market need that online fathers address, as implied before, I think may be indicative of both an individual and systemic failure. But before we discuss what these fathers are offering individually, the flaws, the good points, the philosophies, and the conditions for their rise and fall, we need to understand precisely what has driven men to the point of turning to these surrogate fathers for order, direction, diagnosis, and ultimately, an antidote to their suffering. We as men and women are somewhat raised to idealize the traditional framework of the nuclear family. The nurturing mother who tends to the household, who takes care of the children, and the providing father who provides the household and provides for the household. He is the breadwinner. He comes home from a workday to a hot dinner, his loving wife, and the embrace of his children. This image, while ubiquitous throughout American media and idealized still to this day by many Americans, is often and is increasingly so incongruent with reality for many. I think that many of you watching this video, while I describe this ideal, either cringed in contempt, either for the ideal itself, or for the sheer childish idealism of such a thing, given how incongruent this ideal has been with your experience. Some of you may have sighed in longing for this ideal to be true, maybe even attainable for you. I think that there are multiple trends that may put this feeling into perspective. The ideal of the nuclear family was popularized during the post-World War II era, roughly 1944 into the 1960s. For most of American history before this time frame, family units more so resembled multi-generational households and collaborative economic communities, which included servants, apprentices, etc. And both men and women often contributed to a family business of some sort, like a farm, a shop, or the trade of certain goods, animal pelts, or other items. Nuclear family units were still present to a degree, but the independently functioning clean-cut image of the breadwinning father and the homemaking mother was popularized relatively recently. I think this paradigm shift is primarily an adaptation to post-war economic era conditions, as it was downsprung from several major changes that had been unfolding for decades before that point. Industrialization moved work out of the household and into factories and offices as they provided more consistent, guaranteed labor versus family businesses, subsequently facilitating a separation of wage labor from domestic life. Where previously families would often grow their own food and produce their own clothes, they'd increasingly move toward purchasing manufactured food and manufactured clothes. As many major areas moved away from farms and plantations to cities and suburban areas, this urbanization and subsequent increase in geographic mobility made large extended households harder to maintain as families increasingly moved for better work opportunities. Additionally, the rise of the modern consumer economy transformed the American home from primarily a place of the production of goods and services to a place where goods are consumed. By the time the post-war economic boom arrived after the GI Bill, which provided World War II veterans with government-funded college and vocational education, low-interest home loans with little or no down payment, business loans, and temporary unemployment benefits to help them transition back into civilian life, these conditions, along with the economic boom facilitated by wartime industrialization expansion, not only created the conditions under which the smaller, self-contained nuclear household would become culturally idealized, but also made it financially viable for millions of Americans. Around 10 years after this era, in the 60s and early 70s, no-fault divorce, second-wave feminism, and the sexual revolution would seem to create the conditions under which father-absent households would multiply exponentially. Before no-fault divorce, people would have to prove abuse, infidelity, or other forms of dysfunction and violation of the marriage contract to be able to legally divorce. After the introduction of no-fault divorce laws across the country, the parameters of divorce were loosened to personally irreconcilable differences. Second-wave feminism also emerged in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s, expanding earlier feminist movements beyond just fundamental freedoms such as voting rights, the property ownership rights of married women, access to education, and the legal representation as regular citizens with their own agency, goals, and interests, but also into broader social and economic issues affecting women's lives. Influenced by works such as The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, the movement argued that many women felt confined by the traditional expectations of marriage, motherhood, and domestic life, facilitated by the nuclear family ideal, but also patriarchal family structures as a whole. Activists pushed for greater workplace equality, legal protections against sex discrimination, and expanded reproductive rights. During the same era, the broader cultural shifts of the sexual revolution and legal changes such as Roe v. Wade reflected a growing emphasis on personal autonomy, particularly around sexuality, family life, and career choices. The sexual revolution was a broad cultural shift that took place across much of the Western world during the 1960s and 1970s, marked by changing attitudes towards sexuality, relationships, and personal freedom. Influenced by factors such as the widespread availability of the birth control pill, shifting cultural norms, and broader social movements of the era, traditional expectations and boundaries surrounding sex, marriage, and family life began to loosen. Additionally, sex, cohabitation, and open discussion of sexuality outside the confines of marriage became increasingly normalized in media and popular culture. As the amount of married people began to decrease, the shame around sexual desire began to decrease. At the same time, legal and cultural changes such as less regulated access to contraception and evolving attitudes toward divorce reflected a growing emphasis on personal autonomy in matters of intimacy, reproduction, and personal relationships. Ideals of shame around premarital intercourse began to dissolve. Over time, marriage age would move up from the late teens and early 20s to late 20s and early 30s, as people would move on to more so prioritize their careers and personal enjoyment and exploration of relationship and sexual dynamics in the teens and early 20s, as it was becoming less structurally necessary to preserve the family unit pipeline. None of these factors, these movements, these cultural trends would slow down in some sense. As the progression of divorces would continue to increase over decades, sexual material and activity in culture and media would continue to become more and more ubiquitous and even idealized in some sense. And soon, third-wave feminism would develop downspring from second-wave feminism. And it's suspected that all of these changes would influence a roughly 2.7x increase in fatherless households. In 1960, around 9% of American households were fatherless. Today, around 25 to 26% are fatherless. That's partially downsprung from the exponential increase in divorces since the same time period. Although there was a temporary divorce surge during the end of World War II due to extreme wartime conditions, the divorce trends we see today are downsprung from the conditions mentioned above, as from 1965 to 1980, divorces over doubled, increasing about 108% during that time frame, and afterwards began a slow decline down to even lower rates than pre-no-fault divorce, but largely as a consequence of there being less marriages proportionally speaking, about 35 to 40% less compared to pre-no-fault divorce in 1965, despite dramatic increases in total population since then. People marrying later in life, people cohabitating before marriage more often, also are factors which may functionally imitate a marriage in some situations. But how does this correlate with any of the young male performance metrics deficits? Well, there are a few trends and asymmetries that are occurring that we need to consider. Young men are currently falling behind young women within academics, in independent housing, and to an even greater extent, in dating participation. After the institutional changes brought about during the 60s, by the 1980s, women's college enrollment had roughly equaled men's. Within 20 years, a near 1.6 to 1 ratio, 65% male and 35% female, had equalized to about 49% male and 51% female. But over the decades succeeding that point leading up to now, while college enrollment for both men and women would continue to climb, the ratio of men compared to women would begin to plummet to the extent that the ratio has become nearly flipped compared to 1965 levels, today being about 40% men and 60% women. A similar story is told by the bachelor's degree graduation statistics, with only 41% of the bachelor's degrees from 2022 to 2025 being earned by men, compared to 59% of them being earned by women. Another near reversal of numbers found in the early 1960s. Grad school enrollment also reflects these ratios, with 39% of grad school students being men and 61% of grad school students being women. Yet another near reversal ratio is found in the early 1960s. Even today, men are about 29% more likely to drop out of college than women. For whatever reason, a collection of reasons, or otherwise environmental and conditional factors, Women began to enroll in college and graduate college at rates significantly faster than men. College enrollment for young adults ages 18 to 24 began to go up after this point as well, but hit a relative plateau around past 2012. Since 1965, college enrollment for young women has over doubled, an over 125% increase from 20% to 45%, peaking in 2012, but only a relative 42% increase for men over the same time period, enrollment increasing from 25% to 37%. Even before second-wave feminism, females tended to outperform males within traditional classroom settings. Many critics claim this to be due to largely modern school being better adapted to developing female psychology than developing male psychology. But also, interestingly enough, the gap between boys and girls globally is most pronounced within reading proficiency. Although a brief side point that will be discussed in later seasons, technological revolutions can and often do dramatically change these figures, like the Industrial Revolution, like the development of the internet, and next, I think, artificial intelligence. Already, due to a variety of different factors, the college tuition and student loan to debt to income ratio has multiplied exponentially since 1965. In 1965, the average annual tuition at a public university was roughly $243 per year, while the median household income was about $6,900 per year, meaning tuition represented around 3 to 4% of the median household income at the time. By 2024, the average in-state public university tuition is about $11,500 per year, while the median household income is roughly $80,000 per year, meaning tuition now represents about 14 to 15% of the median household income. That's roughly a 4 times increase in tuition burden relative to income. Over the same period, the total student loan debt has exploded from only a few billion dollars in the 1970s to roughly 1.7 trillion today, making student loan debt payments the second largest category of consumer debt, aside from mortgages. According to data from the US Census Bureau and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the median American home cost about 2.9 times the median household income in the mid-1960s, compared to roughly 4.8 times the income today, meaning the housing price to income ratio has increased by around 65 to 70% since that era. For young Americans, this means that leaving home, establishing independence, and forming a household has become significantly more difficult than it once was. Many now remain in the parental home longer than previous generations. Even though the academic performance asymmetry between young men and young women has become more pronounced in favor of women over time, the housing asymmetry has remained largely the same, if not shrunken. In 1960, only about 11% of men and 7% of women aged 25 to 34 lived with their parents. Today, roughly 20% of men and 15% of women in that same age group still live in the parental home, according to the US Census data. But probably one of the most visceral asymmetries, and by far one of the most popular asymmetries talked about today, so much so that entire industries and personas have been created in response to this very asymmetry, is dating. About 63% of young men ages 18 to 29 currently describe themselves as single, meaning not in a committed relationship or cohabitating. Conversely, only 34% of women within the same age bracket describe themselves as single, and of the singles, young men are 43% more likely to be looking for a relationship than single young women. The discrepancy between male and female singlehood even further exacerbates itself within the early 20s age bracket, where the difference is 75% males reporting as single and 46% of females reporting as single. The 18 to 29 female singlehood rate since the year 2000 has remained roughly static, bouncing in between 32% and 34%. However, the male singlehood rate within the same time frame has risen about 20 percentage points, meaning a relative 50% increase. To say the least, this is a baffling discrepancy, and I know you may be thinking that I'm missing some essential factors to take into account, such as that historically women have tended to prefer to date older men, even often around 2 to 4 years on average. Additionally, since 2008, young male non-participation in sexual activity ages 18 to 29 in the past year has increased from 10% to 28%, in 2018, while female non-participation only increased from 8% to 18%. Today, the gap between young women and young men is even wider, with young men citing 24% and young women citing 13%. Now, I know that there may be some red pill manosphere types watching. They're probably spamming in all caps in the comment section. For the viewers who have no idea what the hypergamy proposition claims, proponents of the hypergamy framework claim the existence of a dominance hierarchy in which men are organized and ranked by women and other men to a certain extent by their competence, their physical and emotional strength, their intelligence, their physical attractiveness, their wealth, ability to disseminate resources, their social calibration, etc., and that women tend to prefer to date across and up this hierarchy via performance. Compelling point, but I think there's more data to come through before we can conclusively state that as a potential cause, so bear with me here. Let's briefly deep dive into some more data. What is competence, and how does that entail dominance? Competence is defined as the ability to produce desired results within a particular domain of performance. Dominance is the ability to exert control over the behavior and outcomes of a particular subject, object, or group of subjects or objects within a hierarchical framework. With these definitions in mind, competence can obviously entail dominance. For example, if a company is more competent at selling effectively the same product as another company, they can have market dominance over the other company proportionally to how competent they are at selling the product. Like how currently Sony has market dominance over Microsoft when it comes to selling their flagship gaming consoles, because Sony has shown themselves to be more competent at selling gaming consoles than Microsoft this generation, and in the past, vice versa. But how cleanly does this map onto human hierarchies, if they're even relevant? Let's examine what we do know. Do women prefer men with greater physical strength compared to other men? According to an article that can be found within the website of the National Library of Medicine, a study was conducted within which they surveyed about 160 women on their preference for bodies that showed visible indicators for greater upper body strength, and none of the women within the experiment showed a significant preference for the pictures of weaker bodies. And visual indicators of physical strength accounted for about 70% of the attractiveness variance. Do women prefer men with greater intelligence? There was a study conducted by these names I can't pronounce in 2009 to potentially answer this question, within which 15 men were recruited and their intelligence was measured using standardized IQ testing. The men were filmed performing tasks designed to display their cognitive ability, problem solving, verbal reasoning, etc., for raters to infer intelligence from. Roughly 200 heterosexual women rated these videos, and the women were asked to rate each man for short-term mate appeal, long-term mate appeal, and overall attractiveness. And the study found that perceived intelligence significantly predicted women's mate appeal ratings, meaning men who appeared more intelligent were rated as more attractive. Additionally, objectively measured intelligence also positively predicted mate appeal. This relationship held for both short-term and long-term contexts, although intelligence was found to matter more for long-term appeal. Interestingly enough though, intelligence did not completely override physical attractiveness, but it added meaningful predictive value, which does track with other research that found that physical attractiveness for both long-term and short-term contexts tended to matter more than intelligence when directly juxtaposed against each other. For example, when compared against each other, women would more often choose the less intelligent but more physically attractive mate compared to vice versa. Do women prefer men with more money and wealth?
If you're a broke boy, just say so.
The research consistently shows that women tend to prefer men with higher earning capacity or economic prospects, especially in long-term mate contexts, and large reviews of mate preference data find that women on average prioritize good earning capacity more than men do. And online dating field experiments show that women disproportionately visit profiles of men with higher incomes. However, women within lower earnings brackets have reliably shown more interest in earnings prospects than women with higher income brackets. Do women prefer men that are more socially calibrated? Personality research using the Big Five consistently shows that emotional stability, social confidence, and interpersonal competence, all traits associated with low neuroticism, higher extroversion, and appropriate agreeableness, reliably amplify male attractiveness. Experimental speed dating studies similarly show that real-time social calibration, conversational fluency, humor production, and emotional regulation strongly predicts romantic interest. In other words, social competence is not just desirable in theory, it does measurably affect mate appeal. Do women prefer more physically attractive men? I'll keep this one brief because we'd be here for hours analyzing studies, as physical attractiveness is extremely varied because human appearances are extremely varied. But the main point is that yes, across speed dating studies, online dating experiments, and cross-cultural mate preference research data, physical attractiveness does consistently predict romantic interest. Now, as previously discussed, we're firmly aware that women also weigh traits like income, intelligence, and emotional stability, especially when evaluating long-term mating prospects. But physical attractiveness remains one of the strongest standards by which mating prospects are judged, and really most people in general make snap judgments about people based on physical appearance, especially when it comes to online dating. Now, what do we know? Is hypergamy real? Not really. But the claim itself is based on a multitude of measurable patterns, so women do generally date across and up hierarchies within particular domains of performance, but it's not really a clean man at top have all narrative, as there are a wide variety of factors to take under account when observing actual mating behavior in real life. Individual preferences, life circumstances, etc. But to give some credence to the hypergamy theory, a man who exists at the higher end of the distribution within all of these avenues simultaneously would be very likely to be perceived as broadly attractive by most women. So, what's producing these asymmetries? Could it be the young men are failing to live up to female standards? Could it be the young man's perception of the dating landscape is what's holding them back? Could it be just a matter of maladaptation to technological advancements, economic restructuring, and rapidly shifting social orders? Maybe it's all of them. Truthfully, I'm not 100% certain, so let's dive a bit deeper. Some of the most severe dips within multiple avenues of performance happened since the 2020 pandemic, many Gen Zers, myself included, being locked inside during our most formative years, and many to this day still report developmental deficits that occurred as a result. Many technological advancements have occurred since the turn of the century: the smartphone, the ubiquity of the internet, the ubiquity of social media, artificial intelligence, and the systems through which they all thrive. The psychological impact of all this long-term remains unclear. However, the plight of the young male, and perhaps men in general, whatever the causes may be, paved the way for speakers and thinkers, salesmen and opportunists, leaders and mentors, online fathers. Millions of young men flock to these figures daily, and they don't seem to be going away, rather evolving. The first of which we'll be discussing is considered to be, by many, an infallible warrior of truth, as outlandish as that may be. But to get to the bottom of this, we have to approach this investigatively. We have to understand. Perhaps if we were unable to conclusively understand at the macro level, maybe by personally analyzing the psychology of the online father and online sons, we'll have more context from which to derive a conclusion. Enter Andrew Tate. Emery Andrew Tate III was born December 1st, 1986, to his father Emery Andrew Tate Jr. and his mother Eileen Tate. He has a similarly branded and well-known younger brother, Tristan Tate, and has a lesser-known younger sister, Janine Tate, who in contrast to her brothers lives a life outside of the public eye. His father was an American international chess master, and his mother, originally from England, worked in catering. He was partially raised in the United States in Chicago, Illinois, and Goshen, Indiana, but after his parents divorced in 1997, his mother took the children back to her home country in Luton, England, when Andrew was about 10 or 11. Tate has frequently spoken about having something of a complicated relationship with his father, describing him as brilliant and even legendary in many aspects, but largely absent during his childhood. This dynamic would later become a recurring theme in Tate's own storytelling about masculinity, discipline, and personal responsibility. And he began kickboxing in around 2005 in the UK, but didn't start his professional career until about 2009, the same year winning the ISKA Full Contact British Champion title. In around 2010, he filmed and appeared in a short-lived British reality competition series called Ultimate Traveller, where contestants compete to complete weekly challenges and survive on a strict budget, with the winner at the end receives a cash prize of 10,000 euros. Tate would stay largely out of the public eye related to kickboxing, having a successful career, winning the ISKA Full Contact Cruiser Championship, his first world title in 2011, the light heavyweight world title within the same organization in 2013, and a 2014 light heavyweight world title under the organization in Fusion. Around 2 years later, he'd once again successfully break into the reality TV space by making an appearance as a contestant on the reality TV show Big Brother, a show within which house guests compete to become head of the household by completing challenges and avoiding eviction by vote. In the final weeks, evicted contestants form a jury that votes to determine the winner from the final 2 or 3 players. Tate's stint on Big Brother was relatively short-lived, as he'd come under heavy backlash for a tweet in 2012 that was extremely controversial, where he claimed that if a woman is, she must bear some responsibility. Additionally, a video surfaced from 2015 that appeared to show physical aggression towards a woman. The incident was investigated by the Crown Prosecution Service, but they ultimately declined to bring charges against Tate, and he endured no criminal conviction. Both the woman and Tate maintained that it was a consensual act and that it was taken out of context, although this controversy would foreshadow the nature of his multiple legal battles in the future. Following his removal from Big Brother, he would largely take a step away from serious kickboxing to focus on business and continued attempts at public visibility. Tate's attempts to attain public visibility would shift away from television appearances to online videos and podcast appearances, within which he provided provocative commentary about women, masculinity, wealth, and Western decline. Around 2013 to 2017, he and his brother Tristan had started and run a webcam studio business within which they'd managed dozens of women to stream to paying male webcam callers.
So I'm not in the industry anymore, but I used to run a webcam studio like 5 or 6 years ago.
In the late 2010s, his operations would move to Romania, a country which is well known for being among the countries with the highest rates of people subjected to sex trafficking, especially within a European context. Tate also reportedly launched a controversially named PhD course in 2018, selling it as a high-ticket program aimed at teaching men dating strategies, in addition to alleged psycho-manipulation tactics and business strategies that allegedly resemble some controversial methods that he deployed to recruit women to his webcam studio. This was one of a variety of courses and products that Tate would offer, including this flagship all-male network, The War Room. It wouldn't be until after the start of the 2020 pandemic that Tate would reach a level of cultural prominence he occupies today, but we can see here that from a young age, he was actively attempting to break into public visibility, and he eventually succeeded. The question is, how did he break into the mainstream, going from failed reality TV star to webcam studio manager to online father? Let's take a dive into the Tate saga. Andrew Tate initially popularized himself by employing people to clip the most provocative bits of his storytime videos via the first iteration of his Hustlers University program, within which there was an affiliate program where students could take these chopped versions of his videos and post them across short-form social media platforms like TikTok, earning commissions from recruiting other students.
Tate's old stuff. Let me chop it up. Let me make a TikTok for Tate. That gets attention. How do I monetize attention? Now people are on my page. How do I monetize it? Well, I can take my referral link. I'm in Hate You. Here, they can sign up, get 50% off my link.
Thousands of accounts participated. Tate's main draw within these clips was his ability to engage the viewer through storytelling and provocative language. Earlier on, he played on the sort of locker room talk persona, in addition to communicating in a hyper-confident, performative, dominant, and entertaining manner, where he'd casually talk about scenarios in an unfiltered, irreverent, and vulgar manner.
She had the most stupid expression on her face. And I thought, is this the person who's gonna kill me? I mean, if 12 tigers attack me and I manage to defeat 11 in unarmed combat with my Aikido and the last tiger gets my neck, that's a fine way for Tate to die. But for this bitch, this idiot, to kill me, that's disrespectful to the universe. Like someone that...
This style of communication has been historically attractive to young men, especially in a late political correctness era society, within which offensive language within the public sphere can be viewed as an attack on a protected class, which is also viewed as unsavory, and it is often socially punished and stigmatized within extreme cases. This juxtaposition to the regulation of language is also part of what made him so provocative to many of his critics, as much of the outrage early in his career was a response to how unapologetically unsavory and absolute he was willing to be towards women in his stories and within his advice.
Another thing I learned from doing this business, I learned something about women, is that they are intrinsically, I don't want to use the word lazy, but I will. They have no interest in world conquest.
He'd later go on to guest star on a popular Manosphere podcast with similarly provocative draw, Fresh and Fit. He'd expand upon his views for these podcast episodes, where he'd contextualize a lot of his clips, expand upon the ideas presented in his videos. He'd promote many common ideas found within the Manosphere, one being the hypergamy proposition, another being women being emotional thinkers and helpless without the leadership of a man, another being feminism, quote-unquote, ruining Western society by brainwashing women into thinking that they should prioritize their career, and that being promiscuous was aspirational, and to view all men as an oppressor class.
When I sit across from feminists, they know not what they do. They don't understand that they're a tool being used to destroy the world. We built the world to protect them.
It wouldn't be long after this that Tate would begin to become a global internet phenomenon, and he'd become the primary subject of conversation throughout the back half of 2022 and early 2023. When Tate eventually broke out of the Manosphere echo chamber into the mainstream, he would begin to be attacked for his off-the-wall claims and vulgar language by many mainstream content creators and even mainstream television media outlets, under the presupposition that he was putting women in danger by brainwashing young men and boys to act harmfully against women by promoting misogyny, male supremacy, and otherwise harmful ideologies. He would also begin to face legal troubles, echoing past potential charges brought against him when he'd come under investigation for human trafficking in collaboration with organized crime groups. During this time, Andrew Tate would also take something of a sharp turn when it came to the way that he'd marketed himself up to this point, as he'd begin to blame a powerful shadow network of elites and institutions he calls the Matrix for not only his own legal troubles, but for the institutional and philosophical issues that he claimed that young men, and men as a whole, were facing.
What is the Matrix?
Good question. When I say the Matrix, I think there are certain agendas which are being pushed. I think the media machine and the judicial systems of the world work together hand in hand. I think the goal is to control people's minds to a point where they don't discuss anything that's important.
He'd frame himself as the mythic underdog, selflessly fighting for our freedom, even though, in his words, he could F off somewhere and enjoy the pleasures afforded to him by his wealth. But instead, he goes on podcasts, interviews, and live streams to speak the truth and, quote-unquote, break the Matrix. But this mythicization probably wouldn't work as... So the mythicization worked, and millions of men of all ages would become utterly captivated by this narrative that Andrew Tate was this Neo/Morpheus type character here to save young men from enslavement by the Matrix and empower them with the tools to change their life and escape the Matrix. It'd be during this time that he'd capitalize on this rebrand and start Hustlers University 2.0, which would pivot away from its less savory predecessor by dropping the webcam studio methods and teaching more common and morally acceptable online income generation methods such as copywriting and freelancing, cryptocurrency trading, e-commerce and dropshipping, social media marketing and client acquisition, stocks and investing, and fitness and mindset trading. He charged $50 a month for this service, and it'll later be rebranded into The Real World in late 2022 for better continuity with Tate's anti-establishment Matrix mythicization. April of 2022, Tate's estate would be raided by the Romanian anti-crime agency DICOT for the first time as a part of a trafficking investigation, but no arrests were made yet, and Tate hadn't yet broken into the mainstream popularity at this point. It wouldn't be until December 2022 that he'd finally be arrested by DICOT on charges of trafficking, SA, and forming an organized crime group.
The Matrix has attacked me.
Months before this arrest, probably to save face in the likely event of an arrest, he began to lay out this mythicized Matrix playbook, where he'd claim that if the Matrix deemed you a threat, first they'd slander your name. If that didn't stop you, they'd come after you financially. If that didn't work, they'd put you in jail. If that didn't work, they'd unalive you.
Times in history where their playbook just isn't working. Cancel it. He's still around. Oh, well, lie about him in the news. Just say he touches chicks. Well, no one believes it. Oh, all the comments are on his side. Everyone's calling us liars. Okay, then do it again. Then do it again. Make up a new girl. Then do it again. Find someone else. Yeah. And they keep attacking me with the same weapons, but the bullets are bouncing off. And
for For whatever reason, after this arrest, he'd begin to frame himself as a victim of a Matrix attack, and his fan base obviously took this explanation as gospel, but interestingly enough, this framing was so potent that some critics would begin to give credence to the narrative after his arrest, as the evidence wasn't yet publicly available, the Romanian legal process wasn't well known, and Tate had been massively deplatformed at this point from all mainstream social media outlets, and as far as the average person knew, Tate was just an angry misogynist guy. Because of all this, there was a degree of plausibility to Tate's claims within the minds of people far away from the intimate details of the Tate phenomenon. Initially, Romanian authorities would have the Tate brothers detained for only 24 hours, but to avoid potential escape from Romania and/or interference with victims and witnesses, their detainment was extended. The Tate team would attempt to make multiple appeals, all of which rejected by the Romanian court, and they'd end up collectively spending 3 months in jail. Of course, whenever Tate was released, he'd once again mythicize this experience as a Matrix attack and a test from the Islamic God to see if he was really the top G. Tate, shortly before this time, would also begin to come out as a recent convert to Islam, and he cited his reasonings for doing so as Islam being a more serious and defended religion than Christianity, as Christianity is often criticized, insulted, and made fun of within Western media and culture without any substantial penalties for doing so.
What's your thought on Islam and everything? Because I know in the Quran and stuff, like you could have up to 4 wives and stuff, so.
I think it's the last religion on the planet.
You think it's the right religion?
I think it's the last religion. So if it's the last true religion on the planet, then it has to be the correct one. Because Muslims are intolerant. And I'm not saying that disrespectfully. Because if you're tolerant of everything, then you stand for nothing.
What is your responsibility to God?
I think God wants me to be the best possible version of myself.
Juxtaposed against Islam, where physical punishment against, in some areas of the world, relatively small infractions is more common. He'd also claimed that Islamic countries are safe and prosperous compared to the rapidly decaying and Matrix-controlled Western countries, because they took control of female agency and disallowed the feminization of their institutions, culture, and men as a whole, according to his framing.
Islam fixes a lot of the problems that men are currently facing.
After Tate's release from jail, Romanian authorities would place him on house arrest, and he'd begin to utilize his emergency meeting live streams as his main method of communication, as he'd no longer be able to travel for in-person podcast appearances. During this time, he and his brother Tristan Tate would continue to insist that they were both innocent and that the Matrix had hired people to make false accusations against them, and that they were completely innocent, morally upstanding, and God-fearing men who'd done nothing wrong but try to fight the good fight for truth and freedom from the Matrix. Two main problems with this framing is that, number one, Tate had already sold webcam studio tutorials in the past and had numerous videos, not even a year old at that point, confessing to his involvement in webcam studio management. Problem number two is that Tate also had numerous videos where he'd verbally confessed, although without explicit evidence shown to have been involved in organized crime, and even using a 21-year-old named Vivian to recruit girls into his webcam studio.
You actually have to downplay your relationship with the girl of 6 years, which is difficult. And I only get away with that because the girl of 6 years plays along. So Vivian's been with me 6 years, she's completely head over heels in love with me, she wants kids with me, everything. When I bring on new girls, I usually pair them with Vivian. Because Vivian's younger, Melissa's like 28, Vivian's like 21.
Massive problem with Vivian. Tate's claims in one video that Vivian is 21, but also claims that he'd met Vivian 6 years before the time of filming, which could highlight something potentially criminally serious. Tate defenders would claim that this could be chalked up as a timeline misspeak by Tate, and militant Tate critics would consider this as an absolute confession of wrongdoing, confirming the allegations made by the Romanian and UK authorities. Tate would be later indicted for his charges in June 2023, and he'd, of course, continue to claim his total innocence, and many Tate defenders would support Tate with undying belief in his supremacy as the top G and hero of the West, and at explicit worst, as someone who'd maybe done unsavory things in the past, but is striving for better in the future. And Tate critics would continue to insist that Tate was fully guilty, and grifting his audience so that he could continue to make money from his online subscription businesses. Tate would continue to frame himself as the masculine hero against the Matrix. After early 2024, nothing else particularly notable would happen within the Tate conversation, aside from recent updates to his legal cases within Romania and the UK. No convictions have been made at the time of the filming of this video. There have been occurrences here and there. He'd have his property raided, once again by DICOT, in August 2024. He'd have more charges and civil cases levied against him of a similar nature. As of 2026, no charges have been proven in court. He'd have his first public return to professional fighting in late 2025, where he'd lose a boxing fight to Chase Demure, an American television star and former college football player. He'd do more interviews, involve himself in political conversations such as the Israeli-Palestine conflict, make a multitude of provocative statements about race relations within the West, and collaborate with other viral figures such as alt-right commentator Nick Fuentes, Black Phil Manosphere content creator Braden Peters, better known as Clavicular, and continue to spread the gospel of Top G's legendary battle against the forces of evil, namely the Matrix. But what were the psychological conditions that Tate would satisfy? Why was a webcam studio manager, self-employed criminal, and salesman able to become a symbol of hope and rebellion to millions of vulnerable young men? Let's take a closer look. Andrew Tate, for many, psychologically fulfilled the role of a father that they'd wish they'd had. He provided an ideal to strive towards, even if that ideal was ultimately a way to save face amidst largely public legal proceedings, to continue to have vulnerable men by his course. It cannot be overstated the impact that this ideal had on millions of young men during the peak of his popularity. Tate's proposed framework through which to understand reality commanded men to become the physically strongest, most physically attractive, intelligent, wealthy, and intimidating versions of themselves. It allowed them to frame themselves as rebellious heroes, taking back their agency and reclaiming the West from the evil claws of unregulated feminism, and rising to the challenges of reality that punishes them simply for existing. He proposed that through personal responsibility and brotherhood, that men could reclaim the West and defeat third-wave feminism. He'd market his online courses as a counter-education to traditional university, claiming that college was an expensive scam that attempted to brainwash you with left-wing feminist rhetoric. While there is some truth to claim that the humanities within many of the American universities have something of a left-wing tilt, there is something to be said about college degrees becoming less valuable but costing more to acquire than in previous years. The reality is that post-secondary education is a major means through which people acquire the essential skills to keep our society afloat. Most people obviously know this, but when you're a frustrated young man who feels as though that they've been left out to dry by society, so to speak, and has no alternative guidance or direction, and really just a person who's interested in living a good quality of life primarily, which most people are interested in primarily living a good quality of life, you aren't really concerned with taking on skills specifically to contribute to a system, even if you do have a vested interest in the upholding of that system. This situation, to me, is reminiscent of the metaphor of the single raindrop making largely no difference in the grand scheme, but billions of raindrops potentially causing a flood. Everybody, to some degree, wants to make money, but how is this instinct relevant to the young male Tate fan, and perhaps men at large? I think it's the masculine performance game. As previously discussed in the dating section, hypergamy may not exist in the way that it's often claimed by Tate and adjacent ideologues, but what absolutely does exist is the psychological pressure for men to become competent compared to other men in the hopes of attracting mates and being viewed with love and respect, and a sentiment felt by many even being considered human. At the core of much of male antisocial behavior is this need to be seen as competent. As we'll go over in detail in future episodes, crash out culture, the recent rise of the alt-right among Gen Z men, and other manifestations of the psychology are released in part fundamentally motivated by a lack of direction and self-worth validation by a strong father figure, subsequently creating the conditions under which self-abandonment within the masculine performance game can occur. Tate understood the game to the extent that he was able to garner a large-scale movement of frustrated young men to side with him for whatever reasons. Tate played on latent frustrations that some men had been feeling in response to many cultural and institutional changes. For many, he archetypically represented the ideal man. He was viewed by his fans as a physically strong and dangerous kickboxer, an intelligent multimillionaire, an irresistible James Bond-esque Casanova, selflessly sacrificing his safety to fight the Matrix. Even though the reality is that he's not a hero, not for them anyway, he's a salesman. He self-admittedly manipulated vulnerable men for profit during his stint as a webcam studio manager, and that skill set can reasonably translate to the way that he's been able to expertly manipulate his fans into viewing him with near religious framing. He was able to monetize the psychological weaknesses and latent frustrations of his audience by presenting himself as an infallible figure and unquestionable masculine authority, only seeking to provide order and direction from behind the screen. He was able to present himself as an online father. Over the past several decades, Western societies have experienced a dramatic shift in family structure. Millions of young men grow up without consistent paternal guidance during their formative years. For much of human history, boys learn how to become men primarily from their fathers or from male figures embedded within their community. Late-born boomers and Gen X were the first generations to be born into the effects of the rise in father absence as children, and with many Gen Xers being the parents of Gen Zers, mine included, Gen Z grew up with father absence already widely normalized as a common household framework. However, we were uniquely affected because we are simultaneously the first generation to grow up from toddlers with the internet and social media at their fingertips, and the first generation to lose touch with many of the IRL social interaction frameworks that past generations made use of. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up with a globalized dating landscape, exacerbating the pressure that young men have to compete within the masculine performance game. This created a unique psychological profile, plus the environmental conditions necessary for Tate to rise. Fathers essentially provide the direction, boundary enforcement, and masculine protection from the elements that children need, and this often uniquely manifests itself through fathers alone. Mothers more so provide the nurturing, empathy, and encouragement that children need. It's not that mothers cannot provide anything a father can provide, it's just that more often than not, they don't. 1 in 4 American children live without a father in the home. Children in father-absent homes are nearly 4 times more likely to live in poverty. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. Around 85% of youth in prison come from fatherless homes. Now, father deprivation may not be the isolated causation, but is a strong correlation with all these stated outcomes. Now back to Tate. Tate represents to many that which exists at the top of the masculine performance game hierarchy. He was a multimillionaire, indicating the possession and ability to disseminate an overabundance of resources, something especially respected within a post-war Western capitalist structure. He surrounded himself with attractive women and frequently discussed his exploits with these women, something especially admirable to the mind of the young male, especially a young male deprived of female intimacy himself. He was a physically strong and capable kickboxer, representing a high capacity for danger and self-defense, highly correlated with the action star superhero archetype that men in general have historically found admirable and aspirational. He was loud, aggressive, articulate, and unapologetic in his speech, communicating in a stereotypically masculine but also off-kilter way that resonates with many young men who felt as though they didn't have a voice and would be socially, institutionally punished for speaking their minds at all or in such an aggressive manner. Tate knew this intimately and would regularly accuse his critics of being lower in the masculine performance game hierarchy than he was within whatever metric he saw fit, a sentiment that was echoed by his fans.
Everyone would choose to be big and strong and smart and rich and fucking have fast cars and beautiful women. Nobody would choose to be a fucking internet masturbator, fat, simp piece of shit. No one would tick those options. Nobody.
Right.
So they would swap with me in a heartbeat if they could. So when they take time out of their life and start writing an email about I'm a bad person, do you think I give a solitary fuck? I know they don't mean it.
He'd accuse people of criticizing him because they were sexually unsuccessful with women, were in subpar physical shape, made less money than him, and promoted the guarantee that all of these things would come to his most dedicated fans if they followed his teachings. And even though this could have very well been the motivation for some of the criticism, this was often clearly a deflection tactic intended to stave off criticism of the psychological devices he'd used to sell his business subscriptions and minimize scrutiny around his legal proceedings. While not every Tate fan was fatherless, struggling in performance, or lonely and frustrated, human beings tend to manifest behavioral patterns and create cultural frameworks in response to economic, sociological, environmental conditions, and undeniably, there were several environmental conditions that gave way to the establishment of these movements. Tate himself is a victim of a fractured home and has confessed to himself have suffered from fatherhood deprivation. He explained that his father had a habit of wasting family resources and gambling exploits, disappearing for days at a time, starting fights with strangers that he'd bear witness to as a child, and overblowing his accomplishments to build an idea within the hearts and minds of his sons. Despite all this, As a man well into his late 30s and early 40s, Tate still speaks about his father with near mythical reverence, perhaps even capitalizing on this mythicization with his Tales of Wudan online series, where he'd make up stories detailing the lessons he learned from his father, personified as Master Po, during his youth. A lot of Tate's antisocial behaviors and pathologies can be partially explained by many correlated statistics that father-deprived youth struggle with. And if Tate's claims about his father are true, he may have inherited this tendency to defend his masculine identity with overblowing mythicization of his accomplishments. This adds a layer of nuance to his position as an online father, where maybe much of what had to do with his rise on a personal level was his own maladaptation to his rapidly changing environment and his early struggles brought upon by his father's inconsistency, irresponsibility, and volatility. So Andrew Tate, he was a myth created by circumstances. The human behind the myth, himself a childhood victim of circumstances. And the power of that myth brought about by millions of young men who saw their experience of those circumstances reflected in Tate. So a wide proportion of young men are falling behind within a multitude of metrics, and we discussed a lot of those environmental stressors that are affecting those men. But what if there was a young man who endured those same struggles and monetized his experience? What if he developed a belief system that millions of young men followed and admired? And what if, in the process, he himself became an online father?
All right, just like my previous video, I don't want to give any sort of average tips that you'll see on every little YouTuber's videos.
That's for the next episode. I'll see you next time.